If you're not using the writing techniques of Ernest Hemingway, one of the greatest authors of all time, you are ruining your fantasy story. After more than 2 decades of writing and analyzing fantasy literature, I've discovered that many writers struggle in key areas of their writing journey. Whether it's finding the right balance in descriptions, crafting authentic dialogue, or overcoming writer's block, these struggles destroy promising narratives all the time. In this video, I'm going to show you how Hemingway's approach to writing will revolutionize your storytelling. These are practical, actionable steps you can start applying today to elevate your storytelling to the next level. But to fully understand the techniques and the application in fantasy, I first need to explain how a minimalist writer like Hemingway, who never wrote a single line of fantasy, holds the key to the success of your fantasy story. Born in 1899, Hemingway lived a life as colorful as the characters in his books. He was an ambulance driver in World War I, a journalist, and an adventurer who loved bullfighting and big game hunting. But it's his writing that truly set him apart. Hemingway's style? Sharp, concise, and packed with emotion. He stripped away flowery language, leaving raw, powerful prose that hits you right in the gut. His novels like The Old Man and the Sea and A Farewell to Arms aren't just classics, they are masterclasses in storytelling. Now you might be thinking, what does this have to do with my fantasy novel? Everything actually. Hemingway's techniques aren't just for realism, they are the secret weapon you never knew you needed for your fantasy world. Whether you're crafting elven dialogues or describing dragon battles, Hemingway's methods can help you drastically improve the impact of your writing. But let me explain why Hemingway's approach is such a game changer for fantasy writers. At its core, great fantasy writing isn't about how many dragons you can fit into a chapter. It's about making your reader believe in your world, no matter how fantastical. And that's where Hemingway's techniques shine. Hemingway was a master of creating vivid, immersive experiences with minimal words. But it's not just about description. Hemingway's approach can revolutionize every aspect of your fantasy writing. First, we have character development. Hemingway created complex characters through their actions and dialogue, not lengthy internal monologues. This technique can help you craft memorable fantasy characters that feel real and relatable, whether they are wielding a sword or a wand. Then we have pacing. Hemingway knew how to keep a story moving. In fantasy, where there's often a lot of world building to do, his techniques can help you maintain a brisk pace that keeps readers engaged. There's also conflict. Whether it's a bar fight in Paris or an epic battle against the Dark Lord, conflict is conflict. Hemingway's direct approach to writing tense, high-stakes scenes can make your fantasy conflicts more gripping and impactful. And then there's themes. Hemingway tackled big themes in his work, often subtly. This approach can adapt to your fantasy, addressing universal themes in a way that resonates with readers without preaching. The beauty of Hemingway's methods is their versatility. They are not tied to a specific genre, they are about effective storytelling, period. So let's start with Hemingway's first writing secret. Picture an iceberg floating in the ocean. What you see above the surface is just a fraction of its true size. This is the essence of Hemingway's iceberg theory. Hemingway once said, the dignity of movement of an iceberg is due to only 1/8 of it being above water. He believed the same should be true for good writing. The power of a story lies not just in what's written on the page, but in the depth of meaning that lies beneath. The iceberg theory isn't just about showing instead of telling. It's about creating a rich, multi-layered narrative where the visible story is supported by a vast foundation of unseen depth. This depth comes from your intimate knowledge of your world, characters, and their histories, even if you don't explicitly state all of it. Let's look at an example from Hemingway's own work. In The Sun Also Rises, he writes, "How did you go bankrupt?" Bill asked. "2 ways, Mike said. Gradually, then suddenly." In just 2 lines, Hemingway conveys a wealth of information. We learn that Mike has experienced financial ruin. The gradually, then suddenly response suggests a long-term struggle, followed by a rapid collapse. It hints at Mike's dry wit and possible resignation to his fate. All of this creates intrigue about Mike's past and character without explicit explanation. Now let's apply this to fantasy. Take this example where we explicitly state a lot of background information. Ilara was the last surviving member of the Ancient Order of the Silver Moon, a group of powerful mages who had protected the realm for centuries before being wiped out in the Great Calamity. Instead of this, you could weave these details into the narrative more subtly. Ilara's fingers traced the cracked silver pendant at her throat. "We should make camp," she said, her voice weary. Moonlight glinted off the ancient runes on her staff as she gazed at the horizon with a hint of sadness running across her face. This approach invites your readers to engage actively with your world. They'll start asking questions. What's the significance of the cracked pendant? What do the ancient runes mean? Why does Ilara seem so weary and sad? It creates intrigue and depth without overwhelming the reader with exposition. But the Iceberg series isn't limited to character backstories. It can be applied to every aspect of your fantasy world building, creating a rich, immersive environment with just a few well-chosen details. Consider how sensory information can imply larger truths about your world. The acrid stench of sulfur hung in the air, a constant reminder of the dragon's presence long after it had passed. This sentence not only describes the setting, but implies the existence and impact of dragons in your world. It shows rather than tells, leaving room for the reader's imagination to fill in the gaps. The same principle applies to environmental storytelling. Instead of lengthy explanations about your world's history, let the landscape speak for itself. Ashok's boots crunched on shattered marble. Once grand pillars, now half buried in the sand. Above, the desert wind whistled through the empty eye sockets of a colossal stone face. These details suggest a fallen civilization without explicitly stating it, inviting readers to piece together the backstory themselves. Cultural elements too can be conveyed through subtle observations of character behavior. Kale pressed his forehead to the earth, his lips moving in silent prayer. Around him, 100 others did the same, their bodies creating a living mosaic on the temple floor. This scene shows religious practices and communal worship without resorting to explanation, allowing readers to infer the importance of this ritual in your world's culture. Even dialogue can serve as a powerful tool for world building when crafted with the Iceberg series in mind. "By the shattered moons," Lyra exclaimed. "If the High Council hears of this, they'll have our hats faster than you can say void magic." This line hints at celestial events, political structures, and magical taboos, while maintaining the character's voice, all without breaking the flow of the conversation. At its core, the Iceberg theory involves strategic omission. By carefully choosing what to leave out, you create space for your readers' imaginations to work. Your goal isn't to hide information, but to reveal it in a way that's more engaging and impactful. Now, if you found anything useful in the video so far, please consider giving it a like to help me grow the channel. Thank you. With the Iceberg theory covered, let me share with you Hemingway's next game-changing technique: simple and direct prose. You might think that fantasy writing demands flowery language and complex sentences to build your magical world. But what if I told you that the key to captivating your readers lies in simplicity? Hemingway once said, "My aim is to put down on paper what I see and what I feel in the best and simplest way." It's like describing a dragon without getting lost in every scale. You want the big picture, not a zoology textbook. Let's break down how this works, starting with the concept I like to call clarity is king. Compare these two sentences describing a sunrise. This is the fantasy fluff version. The golden sun climbed slowly over the rolling hills, its warm light touching the dew-covered grass and awakening the slumbering forest. This one is Hemingway inspired. The sun rose slowly, warming the hills. Dew sparkled on the grass as the forest stirred. The first sentence might seem more fantastical, but it's actually harder for readers to visualize. The second one, despite its simplicity, puts your readers right there in the scene. It's clear, immediate, and lets your reader's imagination fill in the details. Next, let's explore how short sentences pack a punch. In fantasy writing, we often fall into the trap of long winding sentences to convey the complexity of our worlds. But short, punchy sentences can actually be more effective, especially in action scenes. Hemingway mastered this technique, using it to create tension and immediacy. Let's look at an example of how Hemingway could have written something in fantasy. The dragon struck, flames engulfed houses, screams filled the air. Each sentence here is a beat, driving the action forward and building tension. This staccato rhythm mimics the rapid-fire nature of the action, pulling your readers into the heart of the scene. However, while this approach demonstrates the power of short sentences, it might feel a bit too choppy for most fantasy readers. The key is to take this principle and adapt it to fit the expectations of the genre. Consider this slightly revised version. The dragon struck, flames engulfed the village, and screams began to pierce the night. This sentence maintains the impact of short punchy prose in the opening, then smoothly transitions into a more flowing style that many readers prefer. The goal isn't to write your entire novel in clipped sentences, but to use this technique strategically to enhance tension, pace, and reader engagement in your stories. Moving on, let's discuss the importance of using strong verbs. Instead of relying on adverbs to spice up weak verbs, choose powerful verbs that do the hefty lifting themselves. For instance, rather than saying, "The wizard walked quickly to the tower," you could write, "The wizard strode to the tower." This not only makes your prose more concise, but also more vivid. Next, let me show you how to embrace the active voice. Active voice makes your writing more dynamic and immediate. Instead of, "The spell was cast by the wizard," write, "The wizard cast the spell." This puts your characters in the driver's seat, making your story feel more alive and engaging. And finally, let's talk about how to cut the flap. In fantasy, it's tempting to include every detail of the world you've built. But remember the iceberg theory, you don't need to explain everything. If a word or phrase doesn't serve a clear purpose, then cut it. Trust me, your writing will be stronger for it. Let's see how these principles might work together in practice. This is an overwrought but not completely atypical example. Beorn's emerald eyes, clouded with the weight of countless battles, gazed upon the once mighty fortress of Ironhold. Its towering ramparts and impregnable walls now reduced to little more than scattered rubble and fading memories of a glorious past. This is a Hemingway-inspired version of that same scene. Beorn stood before the ruins of Ironhold. Crumbled walls told of the fortress's fallen glory. His hand tightened on his sword hilt, remembering. The second version is clearer and more immediate. It also leaves room for the reader's imagination, inviting them to fill in the emotional context of the scene. By mastering the art of simple and direct prose, you'll make your fantasy more accessible and engaging. This doesn't mean sacrificing the richness of your world or the depth of your characters. Instead, it's about finding the right words to bring your vision to life in the reader's mind. Okay, we've explored the iceberg theory and simple prose. Now let's fully unlock Hemingway's approach to dialogue, a technique that is all about subtext. What's not said is often more important than what is. Let's see how this could work in fantasy. "The sword feels heavier these days," the old warrior said. "You could always put it down," his squire replied. "Not yet. Not while I can still lift it." This exchange isn't just about a sword. It's about aging, duty, and the warrior's reluctance to retire, all without explicitly stating any of it. Next, Hemingway used dialogue to create rhythm and pacing. He often employed short, rapid-fire exchanges to build tension. Consider this fantasy adaptation. Dragons? Yes. How many? 3. Gods help us. This staccato rhythm creates urgency and tension, perfect for high-stakes fantasy scenarios. But Hemingway also mastered the art of characterization through dialogue. Each character should have a distinct voice. In a fantasy world, this could mean, "Ain't no dragon that can't be killed," the dwarf grunted. "Perhaps," the elf mused. "But at what cost to the forest?" "Bah! Trees grow back, gold doesn't." Here we get a sense of each character's values and background without explicit description. Now, let me show you how to implement these techniques. First, eliminate dialogue tags. Hemingway often let the dialogue speak for itself. Instead of, "He said angrily," show the anger through the character's words and actions. Then use dialect judiciously. A few well-chosen words can suggest an accent or culture without resorting to phonetic spelling. Also consider to employ silence. Sometimes what a character doesn't say is more revealing than what they do. And finally, don't forget to create conflict. Even friendly conversations should have an undercurrent of tension or opposing goals. Let's see these principles in action. "You're going to face the dragon?" The innkeeper's eyes widened. "Someone has to." "But you're just a girl." She placed a gold coin on the counter. "I'm a knight." The innkeeper nodded slowly, looking at her battered armor. "What's your name?" "Does it matter?" He pushed the coin back. "It will when they tell your story, good or bad." This exchange reveals character, creates tension, and hints at societal expectations, all while moving the plot forward. And it does so without a single dialogue tag. With all these techniques in mind though, even the greatest writers face moments when the words won't come. Yes, Hemingway too stared at the blank page sometimes as if it was a particularly stubborn dragon that refused to be slain. But instead of giving up, he developed strategies to keep his writing flowing. So let me tell you about his methods for overcoming writer's block and maintaining consistency. Start by creating from everything. Hemingway believed in drawing from a vast pool of experiences and imagination. He once said, "From all things that you know and all those you cannot know, you make something through your invention that is not a representation, but a whole new thing truer than anything true and alive." Now, that might sound quite complex, but for fantasy writers, this is incredibly liberating. It basically means you're not limited to writing only what you personally experienced. Instead, you're encouraged to blend real-world knowledge, observed realities, personal emotions, and pure imagination to create something entirely new. Now, Hemingway was also a believer to stop when you're going good. This might seem counterintuitive, but Hemingway swore by it. He advised the best way is always to stop when you're going good and when you know what will happen next. If you do that every day when you are writing a novel, you will never be stuck. The idea is to leave yourself a clear starting point for your next writing session. Instead of exhausting your ideas and facing a blank page the next day, you'll have a direction to pursue, making it easier to dive back in. Then there's also the idea about the one true sentence. When facing writer's block, Hemingway would focus on writing one true sentence. He explained, all you have to do is write one true sentence. Write the truest sentence that you know. In fantasy writing, this true sentence doesn't have to be factual. It should be emotionally true, something that resonates deeply with you or your character. This can be your anchor, the starting point from which the rest of your writing can flow. And then there's the concept of embrace the first draft. Hemingway was a firm believer in the power of revision. He famously said, the first draft of anything is shit. This mindset frees you from the pressure of perfection. For fantasy writers, this might mean allowing yourself to use cliches or imperfect world building in your first draft. The important thing is to get the story down. You can refine your unique magical system or subvert those fantasy tropes in later drafts. Another important concept for Hemingway was to develop a consistent routine. Hemingway was known for his strict writing routine. He would wake up at first light and write until he had reached his daily word count goal. About his routine, he once said, when I am working on a book or a story, I write every morning as soon after first light as possible. There is no one to disturb you and it is cool or cold and you come to your work and warm as you write. While you don't have to write at dawn, establishing a consistent routine can train your brain to be creative at certain times. Whether it's early morning, late at night, or during your lunch break, find a time that works for you and stick to it. By employing all these strategies, you can develop a more consistent and productive writing practice, even when inspiration seems elusive. And to make sure all these insights don't go to waste, watch this video here next, where I share 16 ways to start your novel and hook your readers from the very first line.